Hi everyone, my name is Amanpreet Kapoor and I'm going to present the work that I did with my advisor, Dr. Christina Gardner McCune at the University of Florida. The title for my talk is Categorizing Research on Identity in Undergraduate Computing Education. Identity has been used to explore a variety of problems in computing education research, such as improving retention, increasing diversity and inclusion, and enhancing student learning. Research in social sciences often suggests that identity literature is fragmented, with researchers building their work on siloed factions in prior work. We were motivated to create a categorization model that could aid future researchers who work on identity to identify relevant literature, and this model can also help us in understanding the gaps and fragmentation in the current computing education research literature. To achieve these goals, we conducted a literature review which aimed to answer the following research question, which is what are the types of papers on identity in undergraduate computing education literature with respect to the semantics or the meaning as well as core contributions of these papers. We followed the guidelines by Kitchenham et al. To conduct a systematic literature review to identify and synthesize prior work on identity in undergraduate computing education literature. For identification, we used two queries. The first one, which was our initial query, was student identity along with compute regex, and then we iterated on that query to identify known work, which gave us a much narrower query, which was using the terms undergraduate student education as well as synonyms of identity along with the computing programs. The papers were identified in 5 databases, which include ACM, IEEE Explore, Taylor and Francis, Science Direct, and Springer Link. We also used Google Scholar and backward snowballing to identify prior work. And what is backward snowballing? It is a technique where we visit the references of the chosen papers and go back to those papers and see if they satisfy our inclusion and exclusion criteria. Based on our queries, there were 825 papers that were hit in these databases, and out of these, 55 were selected based on our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So our inclusion criteria consisted of 4 topics, which is the first one was all papers should have a study participants which were either enrolled in undergraduate computing programs, or they were in a particular computing course or a professional development activity. Other than that, we also included papers that had practitioners teaching an undergraduate computing course, or the data that was in the papers were related to computing undergraduate degree programs. The papers also satisfied the other 3 criteria, which was the construct under study was identity, or a relationship to identity was derived systematically. The types of papers that we selected were either journal papers, conference papers, dissertations, workshop, or work in progress papers, and the language of publication was English. The papers that were excluded included posters, doctoral consortiums, or any publications that were less than or equal to 2 pages. We also excluded non-peer reviewed articles or studies focused on K-12. And finally, any opinion paper with no empirical evidence was also excluded. The papers in our corpus were analyzed using an inductive content analysis based on grounded theory, and we used a constant comparison technique to understand if the papers were talking about similar ideas or not. And we used first open coding to categorize the raw data, which was the relevant sections in the paper, into open or primary codes. And these codes were further abstracted into categories, and from these categories two themes emerged, which was identity-centric studies and non-identity centric studies. We achieved theoretical saturation after 27 of the 55 papers in our corpus, which means no new codes, categories, or themes emerged after about 50%, after coding about 50% of our data set. So some of the trends that we saw in our corpus was most papers were published after 2014, which is 80% of the papers were published in the last 8 years or so. And you can see the numbers are a little less after 2019 because we actually conducted the search in March of 2020, so more papers might have been published, but it's quite evident that the interest on identity in computing is increasing over the recent years. Most papers were published in conferences or followed by journal papers. Then there were a couple of dissertations and one workshop paper. And most of these papers were published in unique venues, followed by the ICER conference where 9 papers were published, and then 6E, ASWE, FIE, HC, and Coley Calling were other prominent venues where papers were published. Out of journals, the only journal that had more than one paper was the ACM Toast Journal. And based on the data in our corpus, we categorized them into 2 themes and 6 categories. And these 6 categories were exhaustive in the sense that all papers fell in one of these categories or in one of these themes, one or more of these categories or one of these themes. And these papers talk about like what are exactly the types of papers on identity in computing, which is, are they describing something about identity? Are they measuring identity? Are they assessing if a particular intervention is helping in identity development? Are is a particular identity construct getting influenced? There were some papers that implied identity and there were others that inferred identity development when they were working on another construct. So let's look into some of these themes and categories. The first one was identity-centric papers, which was about 45 papers or 82% of our corpus. And this theme included papers that had identity as a central construct under study, or the authors explicitly determined the relationship of the construct to identity through one or more research questions. Researchers often situated their work in prior work on identity in this theme. In this theme, there were 4 categories. The first one was qualitative description and conceptualization of identity. And these papers described either a type or component of identity, such as professional identity, nerd identity, narrative, group identity, gender identity, and so on, or they explained processes that aid in the representation of identity formation, such as participation in discipline, engagement, alignment, or imagination. How do these processes help in identity formation? One example of papers in this theme was Parker's work on description of CS professional identity formation in CS. And some of the gaps or patterns we found in this particular category was the papers were using quite a lot of terminology, which was 20 different terminologies such as nerd identity, group identity, computing identity, and so on was used. But the most common ones were identity, computing identity, and computing professional identity. Note that computing identity is a bit different from what is covered in engineering identity literature, which is, when we talk about engineering identity, engineering identity basically means that a student or a person sees themselves working as an engineer in the future, but computing identity included terminology that was specific to using computing rather than doing computing as a professional. I think the computing professional identity was much in line with engineering identity in our field. There was also divergent descriptions and definitions, which is, for example, proxies for professional identity in computing. There were some papers that were using future roles or future professions as a proxy for professional identity formation, while others used association with nerd stereotypes. The descriptions often had overlapping and similar constructs, but they used different terminology. The second category was quantitative operationalization to develop an instrument, and these papers focused on developing instruments to measure identity. There were three constructs that were measured, one called computing identity, another one CS professional identity, and the third one for ethnic identity. For instance, computing identity was measured through performance, recognition, and interest, or CS professional identity through future role alignment. And an example was Mahadio et al.'s work on determining efficacy of a STEM identity model in computing. Some of the gaps we observed in this category was there were no papers yet that reuse these instruments, and we would recommend more papers in the future reuse them. The one of the instruments was not validated, and the instruments developed so far were rooted in socio-cognitive theories, although there's a lot of work that has been done using socio-cultural theories. So in the future, more instruments can be developed that are focusing on the socio-cultural side as well. The third category was assessing interventions for identity development or formation, and in this category, 9 papers focused on studies that tested whether an intervention can be used for promoting identity development. Common interventions that were studied included undergraduate research. There were 3 papers on this: professional conference, scholarship program, or activities in formal coursework. An example is Boyer et al.'s work on assessment of computing identity mentoring program, which was primarily focused on undergraduate research. Some of the gaps we observed in this category was most work used pre-post designs without control groups, and all but one use self-reported data. So there are more opportunities for measuring identity implicitly using socio-technical systems or learning management systems to understand identity formation more implicitly. Also, the relative strengths of participation in these interventions was missing, which is we don't know how much does participation in research programs matter more than participation in coursework, and there are no common metrics to assess them. Lastly, the last category in this theme was determining the relationship of identity to another factor. And in this category, papers focused on describing studies that determine the relationship of identity to another factor, construct, process, or context. These papers usually would have research questions of the form: how does factor X influence identity Y, or identity Y influence factor X? For example, papers asked, how does gender identity influence professional identity in computing, and so on. For example, again, Davis et al.'s work explored the relationship between nerd identity and engagement with CS coursework, and this category had quite a lot of papers, which is 65% of the papers sought to determine the relationship of identity to another factor. The biggest gap in this category was there was no unifying work that provided a mechanism to organize or synthesize these factors, as well as the strength of associations are missing, which means we do not know how much one factor mattered over another. There were no replication studies whatsoever, so in the future we need more of those, as most of these factors that have been suggested were through qualitative research. The second theme consisted of non-identity centric studies, and this theme consisted of papers where researchers studied another construct rather than identity, and they assumed or inferred a relationship to this other construct to identity. These papers rarely cited identity literature, and they defined the research questions in terms of central construct under study rather than identity. The first category was assumption of a construct as an implicit proxy, and there were 2 papers that used sense of belonging as a proxy for identity. Example was Colleen Lewis's work, et al.'s work, on understanding the relationship between sense of belonging, students' communal goals, and perception of computing. And the gaps we observed in this category was there was inconsistency in terminologies, as well as the assumptions were not explicitly stated, So we aren't sure, or there was ambiguity in the sense whether this was implied by the researchers, or is it something that was an error on their part. The last category in this theme was inferring a relationship between a construct and identity, and 8 papers fell under this category. And these papers focused on studying another construct, phenomena, or intervention, and while understanding this other construct, phenomena, or intervention, they found an influence on person's identity. Example was Thayer and Co.'s work on identifying barriers that are faced by coding bootcamp students, where they found that students who go through boot camps have difficulties in claiming identity as a software engineer. Again, this work was also not grounded in prior work on identity, so in the future there is scope for improvement. So just to sum up, we found 6 categories and 2 themes describing the types of papers on identity in computing. And as you can see from this Venn diagram, that there were overlaps between some of the categories, but the themes were both mutually exclusive as well as exhaustive. Finally, I would like to conclude the presentation suggesting some of the future work, like what can the community learn from all of this. We don't have a common definition for identity yet, neither we have consensus on what that entails. Because of all of these diverging definitions. We also need to conduct more rigorous work and use more consistent terminology. There's a lack of replication studies in this area, and papers would often not cite relevant literature, so future peer review process needs to ensure that the work is grounded. Finally, we need to have a theory that kind of blends all these factors together and suggest how identity forms, and there is scope for using socio-technical systems to understand identity formation through implicit means, apart from the current status quo, which was primarily either interviews or surveys. Thank you, and if you have any questions, feel free to use my email. I would also like to thank the members of my committee, Dr. Christy Boyer and Dr. Sharon Chu, as well as Cheryl Reish, Mehmet Selepkulu, and the anonymous reviewers of the Kohli Calling Conference for providing feedback on the preliminary drafts. Have a wonderful conference, everybody. Take care.